about the media and the impact that it has had on you, on your children, maybe even your grandchildren. And so in this hour, I'm going to try to cover some things about, obviously, television and the traditional media, but we're going to spend some time talking about the so-called new media, Facebook and MySpace and Twitter. What about iPhones and Blackberries and video games? So, yeah, I suspect that I want to walk out of here quickly because, you know, the times that I've spoken on media before, oftentimes people say, oh, okay, that's pretty good. I got a feeling a lot of you are going to say, you've gone from preaching to meddling because you're really talking about what we're dealing with. But I hope that I'll be sharing with you a lot of information that will cause you to reevaluate the amount of media in your life. And to get us started, what I thought I might do, first of all, is spend just a little bit of time, if we could, on the first slide that we'll put up here. And it comes from George Barna, because a number of years ago, George Barna was really trying to identify what he called the sources of significant influence. Now, one of the things that I do from time to time is do interviews with people like George Barna. More recently, Pro Ministry spent an enormous amount of money with the Barna Group to do the most extensive survey of the millennial generation that has ever been done before. Those are those born between 1980 and 2000. And this was a survey of born-again millennials. So I am very aware of the kind of research that George Barna has been doing. But one of the pieces of research he did a number of years ago was to look at the sources of significant influence in American society. By that, he was trying to find out what affects you. What are the kinds of inputs that maybe affect your worldview? And since this is a Worldview conference, I thought we would talk about this. And when he published that material in a number of places, but in one particular article in Christianity Today, it was very interesting because he came to the conclusion that the sources of significant influence today in American society are movies, television, the internet, books, music, public policy and law, and family. Now, if you look at the first 5 of those, they all have something to do with the media. And so it tells me something very significant. That is that we are living in a world in which oftentimes media is the primary shaper of values in our society. And the best way to illustrate that is to go back to that article that was in Christianity Today, which generated more letters to the editor than any article in that particular period of time. And the reason for that was the next particular piece that he posted. And that is, based upon his evaluation of the sources of significant influence, he concluded that the church is not even in the top 12 sources of influence today. Now think about this for just a minute. Imagine you could go back in time, maybe go back 50 years in time, maybe 1962. We'll park a DeLorean out here, get Doc to program in 1962, and we'll go back 50 years to Bellevue or Seattle. What do you think the sources of significant influence were in the early 1960s? I'm thinking, what? Church and family, don't you think? If you go back 100 years, nobody would doubt that. If for no other reason than some of these things did not exist. There was no internet at that time, right? Certainly we had books, we had some movies, but certainly not as many as we saw on television and things of that nature. And so you can see that in a very profound way, the media has begun to be, and is continuing to be, the primary shaper of values. Whenever I speak at a Worldview weekend conference or at Apologetics Worldview conferences, oftentimes they ask me to speak about media to young people because they live in a world which I'm going to describe as a world of media storm. A world in which it is very, very different in terms of the amount of media that they actually consume. Now, if you are taking some notes, I'll try to go through this slowly, but I'll give you a few statistics. And you will find out very quickly I have more statistics than you have patience for, but let's see if we can kind of go through a few of these real quickly. The first is that we know that by the average student, by the time he or she graduates from high school, he or she will have seen 22,000 hours of television. 22,000 hours of television. Now, to put that in perspective, they will have spent about 11,000 hours in a classroom. Now, some of you might say, well, that just doesn't seem right at all. Well, I'll go to the math on that number. And the reason for that is the AC Nielsen company spends millions and millions of dollars to find out which TVs are on, what channel they're tuned to, and who's watching them. 22,000 hours of television. Now, I know some of you in the room here don't even have a television set, and so we're talking about the average. And you say, how does the average go up so high? Well, you know, if you've ever done church visitation, sometimes I come into various homes and the TV's always on, kind of like this electronic fireplace in the corner there. They never really turn it off. Maybe that's how that percentage goes up. But still, with various surveys, we have concluded that the average young person, by the time he or she graduates, sees 22,000 hours of television. Well, by the time they get into their teen years, something else happens. They start listening to music, matter of fact, long before their teen years. But this survey is a little more fuzzy because it's based upon an article that was in the Journal of the American Medical Association. It's using diaries and interviews, but it concluded that during just the teen years alone, the average teenager listens to 10,500 hours of music. I think that number is low because that survey was done a number of years ago before the market penetration of what? The iPod. And that's changed everything, hasn't it? So if anything, that number is very, very high indeed. Look at another one. Let's talk about the internet. Now this is very, very difficult to get a handle on. Studies, University of California, San Diego, and other places have concluded maybe that number is about 13,000 hours, but that number is a little fuzzier, obviously. It's based upon all sorts of attempts to try to get a handle on it. And interestingly enough, that number is going up every single year simply because if you think about it, the last students to have graduated from high school probably, let's see, they were born maybe you think in 1994, 95, somewhere around there. There wasn't total internet penetration at that time. Al Gore hadn't invented it yet. Just kidding. But you know, obviously that's going up as well. Now, if you look at this, you're going to say, wait a minute, we're starting to run out of waking hours. And that's because of something we'll look at in another slide in just a minute called what? Multitasking. That is, I'm supposed to be doing my homework while the TV's on, while I'm texting some of my friends and on the computer supposedly doing work, although I'm checking my Facebook at the time, all being done simultaneously, right? Shake your head yes if you've seen this before. Okay, let's talk about a few more real quickly, and that is obviously video games. I'll have more to say about that in just a minute. There was a survey done by Lifeway with the Southern Baptist Convention, and they concluded in terms of their surveys that if there's one technology that is definitely associated with the millennial generation, it's video games, and I'll have more to say about that in just a minute. And then of course movies and videos and DVDs, and we could even talk about all the written things as well, things like books and magazines and newspapers. Now, to get a handle on this, let's, if we can, look at a chart that I created just recently that is based upon the Kaiser Family Foundation. And what you find here, first of all, is in terms of total media consumption, you see that from 1999 to 2009, it continues to increase. So young people are not only watching more television, they're all not only listening to more music, they're also using the computer more. So the amount of media consumption for youth, 8 to 18, increases every year. And again, one of the things I might point out is if you look at the total amount of media consumption, it actually exceeds the number of hours they actually watch it. Now, it's in about the 8 hours, but you can see it's in 10 hours because they overlap then the areas of multitasking. Well, what I want to try to do is, as we go through our presentation this afternoon, try to give you some general principles about the media, and then I will come back and give you some specific things about television. Why? Well, you first of all can see that television still is the dominant media. More TVs are in homes than homes that have indoor plumbing. There's a joke there, but I'll miss the punchline for it for just a minute. It's the most ubiquitous form of media. And so let's come back, as we talked just a minute ago about media in general, and talk about television in particular. And the first statistic I put up there was the fact that we have young people that have seen about 22,000 hours of television. If you've been paying attention, you recognize that all I've really done is talk about the sheer quantity of media input. I haven't talked about the quality of that media input. What happens during those 22,000 hours? Well, the average young person will have seen 16,000 televised homicides. This is a level of visual violence that is unprecedented in the history of the world. More than that, they will have seen about 200,000 acts of violence. Again, hitting, hicking, slapping, those kinds of things. And if you want to talk about materialism, for those of you that are pastors or Sunday school leaders, here's a great statistic you can use to talk about materialism. During that time, they will have seen 640,000 television commercials. So again, you can see that we are dealing with something that is unprecedented. Young people today live in a media storm. And I think it is important not only for them, but for all of us to really begin to exercise discernment. How do we do so? Well, again, we can think about various verses. I'll put these on the screen, but certainly as I look at my Bible, I don't see words like iPod, iPhone, DVD, CDs, or even what we were talking about a minute ago, cassettes. None of that's in the Bible. But I think it does give us some very good principles to apply when we talk about discernment in general. And so the first thing we might do is turn to 2 Timothy 2:2. And here, as Paul is giving some really final instructions, this could have been perhaps the very last letter that Paul wrote to Timothy. What does he say as Timothy is establishing churches and beginning to consider the leadership that he is going to be leaving in these churches? He tells him, first of all, to flee from youthful lusts. But as Paul does so often, as soon as he talks about what to avoid, what does he then say? Here is what you should do, and that is to pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace. And so again, I think a wise and discerning Christian is going to evaluate those things that are going to cause feelings of lust in their life. Another verse that we can certainly look at would be Colossians 3:8. In Colossians 3:8 here, we see that Paul is talking to the Colossians. In the previous chapter, in 2:8, he talks about the fact that you should not be taken captive by false philosophies and empty deception. So he recognizes that even in the first century, there was a real danger for people to be caught up in the false ideas of the world. Now he comes on to also tell them, but now you must rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Now, does that mean that I could never read something that has anger in it? Well, the Bible has anger in it. No, that's not what it means. But it does mean that a wise and discerning Christian is going to evaluate the input. What's coming in my eye gate and ear gate? And is it having an impact? For those of us that do computer programming, we used to learn an old phrase: garbage in, garbage out. And so again, a wise and discerning person begins to evaluate this. What about filthy language? You know, we'll go into some of these Christian schools sometimes, and the teacher walks out and say, okay, I want to just ask you a question. How many of you have used a swear word in the last week? It's amazing how many hands go up. And I go, okay, well, where did that come from? Did your teacher talk like that? Oh, no. Well, does your pastor talk like that? No. Do your parents talk like that? No. Where'd you hear that? Television, movies, in other words, the media. And again, we can see how that can have an influence. We can talk about a positive aspect of that as well, because Paul talks about in Philippians 4:8 that we should think on those things which are true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable and excellent and praiseworthy. So certainly, again, an individual who is wise and discerning is going to evaluate what is coming in from the media and from other sources. And certainly that is the case. And one last verse, I won't take too many more verses, but Romans 13, verse 13 here says, let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in orgies or drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Now there are lots of verses, and I've only given you a few in the interest of time, but they all really come down to one key word, and that is what? Discernment. It seems to me that it is important and was important for believers in the first century to have discernment, even in their world. It's even more important for us now today in the 21st century to have discernment. Well, how do we do that? You know, I don't know about you, but sometimes I am in the midst of a church and I hear a great sermon, but I walk out and I go, well, the pastor has admonished me and encouraged me to do something, but I have not a clue as to how to start. And discernment's one of those. Where do we get discernment? Well, I'm going to suggest to you 3 simple steps on how we can develop discernment as it relates to the media or other things as well. And the first is to simply stop. That is, stop what you're doing long enough to concentrate. I've noticed a technique that has been developed over the years by not only young people but old people as well, and that is they just sort of lock into the media. I've had young people, for example, that just say, I cannot study in a quiet room. I've got to have all sorts of media input, but they're not really evaluating it. And I learned that early on, because sometimes I would come home and I'd say, "Hi kids, I'm home. Kids, I'm home. Hello kids, I'm home." I'd have to grab the controller, go click, click, turn the TV off, and then there's sort of this blink, blink, and then, "Oh, hi Dad," you know, which is the phenomenon known as what? TV zombies, right? But you know, we have a lot of people, and many of us, if we were really honest, sometimes don't stop long enough to concentrate. You know, even in church sometimes we'll be singing these hymns and everything, we're not even thinking about the words. We turn on the radio, but we're only really half listening, but you know that's coming in. We'll sit down and we're just exhausted, we turn on the TV set and we just kind of want to veg out. It's just coming in, but we're not stopping long enough to concentrate. The second thing we need to do is first stop, second listen, that is give attention to what is entering your mind. I'm sort of already implying that. And oftentimes we allow stuff to come into our minds, but we never really evaluate it from a biblical worldview. Years ago, we used to do a very high-tech slide illustrated presentation called Between Rock and a Hard Place. And we would take on rock music, and a lot of our speakers, youth speakers, would go out, and we would go into various churches, and sometimes to get them started, we'd play some of the music, and the kids would be singing along with the music, and then we would then put up on the screen the words that they were singing, and do kind of an exegesis, evaluate it. And a lot of times at the end, the kids would go, "Wow, I didn't know it said that. You just sang the words to it." "Yeah, but I didn't know that's what it meant." You know, again, listen. Give attention to what is entering your mind. Stop, listen, finally, look. That is to look at the consequences of entertainment in your life. Now, if you think I'm against media, I'm in media, up to my eyebrows in media. But those of us in media understand its potential benefits and its harm. If you think I'm down entertainment, I'm not. I've been recommending websites. I'm going to do that again. I'm on radio, and I hope that you can listen to me on radio. And if not, you can certainly go on websites. I'm on television. You can watch me on television. I write books. I write newspaper columns. I believe in the media, but I also recognize its potential dangers. And it seems to me, again, that a wise and discerning believer would look at the consequences of entertainment in their life. Do we know how media affects your worldview? Yes, we do. And over the next couple of minutes, let me try to share just a few of the studies that are well known. Most all of them are in a book that I'll mention at the end. And again, all of these information points can probably be found in one way or another by going to our website, probe.org. You type in the word media, and the thing just goes, you will find lots of articles on art and music and film and television and the new digital media and all sorts of things, video games, on and on and on. So you'll find lots of this, but I'm going to, in the interest of time, try to first of all summarize this in a general way. And this comes first of all from my book on Christian ethics in plain language. There's a chapter in there on media. This is the book used in a lot of Christian universities and some Christian high schools. It has all sorts of chapters on abortion, euthanasia, genetic engineering, crime, punishment, capital punishment, adultery, homosexuality, premarital sex, media, government, environment, and many, many other issues. And the media chapter talks about, first of all, that when we talk about the media presents an unreal view of the world. Here's a newsflash. Reality TV is not reality, right? You know, it presents kind of a superficial view of the world, which is illustrated by my second point, and that is the media presents an oversimplified view of the world. One-dimensional characters, predictable plots. Life is much more complex than that. And certainly it is presenting a very simple, oversimplified view of the world, an unreal view of the world. But most importantly, my biggest concern is that it desensitizes its viewers. Today's shocking headlines is tomorrow's ho-hum. Things that would never have been shown on television 20 years ago are shown today. Things that are in the movies oftentimes were not necessarily done by movie producers. And that's not just me saying that. I've been with television producers that say, you know, we're pushing the envelope all the time. We're showing things that we didn't dare show 20 and 30 years ago. Anybody disagree with that? Everybody shake their head, and we'll see if everybody's still somewhat awake here. Because obviously that is the case. Okay, so we can look at media in a general sense, but again, let's go back and look at television in particular, just as one of our samples, okay? And one of the best studies that was ever done was done at the Annenberg School of Communications, the University of Pennsylvania, George Gerbner and Larry Gross. The reason I use this is even though it's in technical journals, they reprinted some of the findings in popular journals like Psychology Today. And one of those that I'm going to pick out, and it's just one of many in my book, is what they call the scary world of TV's heavy viewer. And that is, they looked at individuals that weren't heavy TV viewers and compared them to people that were heavy TV viewers, and they found that heavy TV viewers had their worldview remarkably changed. I think we would agree with that, but let me now prove my point. And the first point is that they found that heavy TV viewers tended to overestimate their likelihood of being involved in a violent crime. Why? Well, because obviously they were seeing violent images on television. By the way, the number of violent images on television I think is going to go up the next time they do these surveys because of all the CSI programs and action films and things like that. But nevertheless, they saw violence on television, so they tended to live, as it said in the title of the article, in a scary world in which they thought the world was much more violent than it really was. Number two, they found that heavy TV viewers tended to overestimate, matter of fact, vastly overestimate the percentage of those people involved in white-collar occupations. Doctors, lawyers, businessmen, things like that. Why? Because most TV programs have to do with people like that. And they also found, interesting enough, that heavy TV viewers always emphasized and vastly overestimated the percentage of Americans compared to the rest of the world. Why? Because most of the programs are about Americans. Now, the point I'm making is not that it is absolutely essential that you walk out of this room today knowing the exact percentage of Americans compared to the rest of the world. But the point I'm making is this. If there are certain things which I can get a statistical analysis of, your likelihood of being involved in a violent crime, the percentage of people in white-collar occupations, the percentage of Americans compared to the rest of the world, if I can show that heavy TV viewing skews their worldview, would it not make sense that other things that are a little less quantifiable, sensuality, materialism, secular ideas, would those be skewed as well? Does that make sense? And I think I can show for any fair-minded individual that a heavy TV viewer tends to view the world differently than the average American. If you're thinking, you recognize I've left something out. I didn't tell you what a heavy TV viewer was. They defined a heavy TV viewer as somebody that watches 3 or more hours of television a day. Nearly half of Americans fit into that category. Do you see the impact? Let's talk about a couple of other issues. What about behavior? We just pointed out one study, and I can give you many others, that show that heavy TV viewing changes your worldview. It skews the way you think and perceives the world. Does it affect your behavior? Yes, it does. Let me use some young people example. A couple come from the Journal of Pediatrics. It's done by the American Association of Pediatricians. And they, a number of years ago, posted a study which looked at some very significant evidence that showed that individuals, in particular teenagers, adolescents, watching sex on television were more likely to have sex. In other words, there was a very definite correlation between the number of sexual images they saw on television and their likelihood to be involved in sex. Does that make sense? As I had one young person say to me, you know, after watching all these sexual images on television, I was thinking I was the only virgin in America because of all the sexual activity. Seeing sex on television lowers the threshold to be involved in sex. Since then, they've also come up with another study that shows that young girls watching these sexual images have a higher percentage also of being pregnant. Some of the follow-up studies. Then also, let's look at the issue of violence. Over 1,000 different studies. This is called a meta-study, which was actually done pointing to what they called a causal connection between media and aggressive behavior in some children. Now, they have these weasel words of causal connection because they don't want to say there's a one-to-one correlation, implying that if your kid watches lots of violence, he's going to be the next axe murderer or serial killer. But the point is that they see a very definite correlation between the two. Matter of fact, in my book, I talk about one of the studies. This was called a longitudinal study. Lennon Aron at the University of Illinois years ago studied 8-year-olds and compared their watching of violent images on television to subsequent behavior on the playground. hitting and kicking and delinquency and those kinds of things. Then he followed those 10 years later. Now they were 18-year-olds and looked again at their visual images that they had been watching, and then whether or not they were juvenile delinquency or other kinds of things, run-ins with the law. And then 10 years later, now they're 28, looks at whether or not there were various kinds of restrictions on their behavior, whether or not they had run-ins with the law, and again saw a very definite correlation between seeing violence and subsequent acting out in that way. Another one that comes from the Journal of Pediatrics has to do with video games and behavior. American Academy of Pediatrics, playing violent video games increases the likelihood of violent behavior. They also went on to point out that a meta-analysis of about 35 different research studies found that playing violent video games significantly increases physiological arousal and feelings of anger and hostility. That was quoted recently by one of your local talk show hosts, Michael Medved, on one of his shows, and certainly has caused all sorts of people to reevaluate video games. And since I'm talking about video games, and I suspect I probably have some gamers in here, let me for just a minute talk about the fact that not all of what are video games are bad. We've done a whole week of radio programs, so you can go to our website, pro.org, to learn more. But we have recognized that, for example, action video gamers tend to be more attuned to their surroundings, because they are actually using those, in a sense, as simulators. They found, for example, that they are more likely, if they're driving down the street, to pick up that a child is running into the street after a ball. So they are sometimes benefiting from some of the activity they do with video games. That's the positive. But there's lots of negatives, as you already began to see. And one of the biggest concerns has to do with the issue of violent video games. Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman's been on my radio program over the years. He actually has taught at places like West Point and actually wrote the book on Killology, because they changed the way in which they trained those in the military many years ago. It used to be that you would shoot at a target, now you shoot at a silhouette, and they began to recognize the various things that they needed to do in order to increase the kill ratios so that those individuals who go into battle will be most effective. Well, Dr. Grossman then began to look at the fact that when he was looking at many of these video games, he said they're almost like the so-called killing simulators that we've used in the military. And then he was in Jonesboro, Arkansas, and when there was a shooting there, and it caused him to really get into the study, he actually provided expert testimony in the shooting that took place in Kentucky of Michael Carneal. And here you have a young individual that really had never shot a gun, and yet he shoots all these kids with a perfect headshot. And you can just see that actually he did everything differently than the way a person would actually shoot a gun. Oftentimes when a person is going to go out and kill people, they tend to empty their gun into one individual. But instead, Michael Carneal, headshot, 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 just almost identical to the way he had played his video games. Now, does it mean that playing violent video games are going to make you violent? No, but again, a wise and discerning Christian would evaluate the impact of some of those kinds of games, even in subsequent behavior. Which brings me to a section which I hope won't be too scientific. We've already heard from a doctor a couple times here, so I won't claim to be a doctor, and I don't play a doctor on television, but I do want to share with you for just a few minutes the fact that we've learned a lot more about how the brain processes media, and this, I think, is very significant. But I'll start with just a kind of a funny story. One of these articles that appeared in Atlantic Monthly generated, again, an enormous number of letters. Nicholas Carr, and in just a minute I'm going to mention some of his newest books, but originally it started with him writing by, matter of fact, the title of the article is Google Making Us Stupid. And what he said is, over the past few years I've had this uncomfortable feeling that someone or something has been tinkering with my brain, remapping the neural circuitry, reprogramming the memory. Now my concentration often starts to drift after 2 or 3 pages. He goes on to then say, immersing myself in a book or a lengthy article used to be easy. My mind would get caught up in the narrative or the turns of the argument. Then he goes on to conclude, now my concentration often starts to drift after 2 or 3 pages. And he began to notice that because he was using the internet, because he was using smartphones and digital technology, it was changing his level of concentration. We now know from all sorts of scientific studies that the brain isn't as hardwired as we thought it was. The brain has, if you want a big long word that you can use to impress your friends, neuroplasticity. In other words, the brain is a lot more plastic than we thought it was. And so the way in which you obtain information and the way in which you interact with media can actually reprogram the neurons. 100 billion neurons there, each one of them have 1,000 different connections. So you have, in a sense, about 100 trillion different possible neuronic connections there. And so as a result, you can form and develop or strengthen and lose various kinds of parts of your brain. And some people have begun to write about the impact that this is having even in the way our brains process information. By the way, most of these people I'm quoting at the moment are not Christians, but again, we can do Christian studies that have been done as well. Stephen Kotler in Psychology Today say constantly using Twitter is reducing the time of concentration to a few dozen words. He says Twitter will tune the brain to reading and comprehending information 140 characters at a time. Okay, a couple of pastors I see here. Can you communicate the gospel in 140 characters? This is what I think we are facing now in the 21st century. It's one of the big concerns. It's one that those of us that speak right now. I know that many of you have tuned in and tuned out even as I've been speaking. Now that may be because I'm not a great speaker, but I think it has a lot to do with the way in which the media has caused you to tune in and tune out and to take things in bite-sized information. And we're now learning that this issue of neuroplasticity, the way in which your brain interacts with media, is being affected and tuned in ways that most of us never really imagined. Let's talk about this a little bit more. Tufts University, they made a very good comment just the other day, one of the researchers. We are not only what we read, we are how we read. And the internet oftentimes puts an emphasis upon efficiency and immediacy above other kinds of things. And I'm starting to see this right now because we see that young people aren't willing and even sometimes aren't able to pay attention for long periods of time. And because we live in this information now generation, there is a lack of patience. I walked in the other day to our little kitchen there, and one of our millennials was tapping and looking real frustrated. I said, "What's the deal?" He says, "Well, the microwave's taking too long." And I thought, oh, we're in a whole different world. The microwave is taking too long, but that again is part of that instant information mindset that is going to be, I think, a real challenge even in our churches here in the 21st century. George Mason University said the brain has the ability to reprogram itself on the fly, altering the way that it functions. And this is true not only for young people, but some of us older folks in the room here, we also have our brains changed. I might mention, Nicholas Carr mentioned just a minute ago, the book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, reminds us again that our brains are able to adapt in very remarkable ways. But because they adapt, oftentimes the new media is even changing the way our brains function. This book here, The Brain That Changes Itself, and we can really begin to alter our neural pathways. Don't think so? Here's a couple of good illustrations for it. If you were to look at the brain of my sister-in-law, she plays the violin. And I will guarantee that those parts of her fingers, or left hand, which are tagged to the right hand, are that part of that brain having to do with her fingers is much larger than any of the rest of you in the room, unless you happen to play the violin. So we recognize that by using certain things, we can grow certain parts of our brain. If somebody becomes blind and they learn Braille, those parts of their brain actually grow larger, having to do with tactile touch. By contrast, places where you aren't using it, you lose that particular ability. If you've ever known anybody from China, I'm going to be speaking at church tomorrow, from Asia, where many people are Asian. If you do not learn certain of the English sounds before you're a certain age, you will never be able to say them. Some of you, if you're trying to learn another language like Spanish or Italian, or those of us that have ever tried to learn Russian or Hungarian, there's certain abilities that you will never have because if you reach a certain age and you have not learned how to form that sound, that part of your brain atrophies and you never are able to actually sound like a native speaking person. So again, we see that. Many of us have just been looking at the anniversary here of Gabrielle Giffords. Remember her? She was the congresswoman that was shot. They're using some of this new technology to actually help her develop other parts of her brain. In this particular book here, for example, it talks about a man who had a stroke, and so as a result, he had to walk on a cane. So they began to actually use that part of his brain, using his hands and other things, to force his brain to actually develop after the stroke. And as a result of using that new technology, that which they're now using on Gabrielle Giffords and others, is causing other parts of the brain to take over and to begin to grow. So this again illustrates neuroplasticity, but it also says that when we use certain kinds of media, it conditions our brains to think in certain ways and to acquire information in ways that we never would have anticipated before. Well, that's probably about scientific enough, but let me just point out again, some people have asked, what about smartphones? You know, whether I have a BlackBerry or an iPhone. And there have been two issues that people have raised. First is the issue of concentration. That is, lots of times when your phone rings or it buzzes in your pocket and you answer the phone, then you come back with the, where was I brain block? Of course, I'm just old enough now that sometimes I walk into a room and I say, why did I walk in here? But this is this, where was I kind of thing that happens that interrupts your kind of train of thought. The other is lots of times people talk about the fact that, well, I can multitask. Wrong. We've done enough brain studies to show that it isn't really multitasking, it's really continuous partial attention. You're not really multitasking, it's just rapid fire switching from information. And as I was driving up 405 here, I'm noticing that any person that has this to their ear, I really try to stay away from them, because if they are concentrating too much on the phone, they're not concentrating on the road. I was staying with some people that are up in Kirkland, and they were talking about this one woman that was actually doing her hair and driving with her elbows. You want to stay away from this woman, because this woman is doing a type of multitasking which I suggest is very, very dangerous. But concentration is one of those issues. The other is creativity. There are all sorts of people right now, both in the Christian world and in the non-Christian world, talking about the fact that we seem to be losing creativity in the 21st century. And some people are suggesting that it might have to do with the fact that because we are sort of on 24/7 with all these smartphones and things like that, that there's no think time or daydreaming. If I were to talk to any of you that have worked in marketing or advertising, maybe some of you that are artists or writers, you will tell me, I bet, that some of the most creative or most insightful ideas you came upon, for the men when you were shaving, for the women when you put on makeup, maybe when you were driving in a car, when your mind was sort of in neutral and your brain was able to connect all sorts of thoughts. Some of the most profound thoughts that have ever been come upon. Matter of fact, some of the greatest scientific innovations came when people were actually Isaac Newton watching an apple drop. One found the benzene ring when he was watching a pool of water, and all sorts of stories that have come in over the years about individuals whose brains were, in a sense, sort of in neutral, and it made those connections. But creativity is dependent upon having think time, having time to daydream. And in this constant, fast-paced, 24/7 news cycle, we're losing quite a bit of that right now. Well, let's, if we can, also talk about one other aspect, and that is media addiction. Now, I've really been sort of resistant to this until now. George Barna, who I mentioned just a minute ago, wrote an article about media addiction 2 years ago. And, I think everything's an addiction, and after a while I kind of get a little tired of everybody being called an addict. But he kind of convinced me of this, because he said, if you look at the signs of addiction that are listed by the American Psychiatric Association, a lot of Americans do fit that pattern in terms of addiction. Moreover, he also pointed out the fact that you have parents that oftentimes understand the dangers of some kinds of media. 3/4, for example, say exposure to of their children to inappropriate content is their top concerns. But guess who ends up buying the video games, letting them go to the movies, letting them watch television, giving them unfettered access to the internet? Those very same parents. So he pointed out some very significant things. What about some of the worldviews in the media? As we wind down today, I think it's important again to evaluate the worldviews of various kinds of media. And certainly one worldview that I think we've been talking about is the issue of how the media is covering various kinds of stories. And a number of years ago, Robert Lichter, when he was at George Washington University, studied those people in the media elite. This is back in the early 1980s, so at that time he didn't have CNN, he didn't have Fox News, but he did have ABC, NBC, CBS, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, the Associated Press, United Press, International, Washington Post, New York Times. And as he looked at the media elite, the people that determine what you see, read, and hear, he found, first of all, that they were very liberal. I know that surprises you. Probably not. But they were surprised how much so. In 1980, when many people were voting for Ronald Reagan, 80% of the media were voting for Jimmy Carter. In 1984, when most of the nation was voting for Ronald Reagan, 80% were voting for Walter Mondale. So it was much more significant than they imagined. The second is more important, though, and that is they found that they were also very secular. That is, 86% of the media elite seldom or never attend religious services. They don't go to church or synagogue. They don't know people that go to church or synagogue. And then likewise, if they weren't in the Christian world or the Jewish world, they also were very humanistic. Found that about 90% of them actually supported a woman's so-called right to choose. So again, imagine if you were pro-life and trying to get your pro-life message out, and the gatekeepers, 90% of them disagreed with you, oftentimes passionately disagreed with you, how difficult it was to get the message out. Well, what about television? That's a little bit different because, interestingly enough, it is not so much located in New York and Washington as the news media is. Some of the outlets are in New York, but most of them tend to be in Hollywood, Burbank, Beverly Hills. And interestingly enough, many of the people that worked in television, the producers and others, were actually having a religious background. It's because there's a lot of people, interestingly enough, in television that are Jewish. But that maybe means that they had a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah a long time ago, but aren't really that religious as well. And likewise, they also found that they were very liberal. But here was the most interesting thing. They found that it was the most secular institution in America. 93% seldom or never attended religious services. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't Christians in Hollywood. There are Christians in Hollywood. As a matter of fact, what tends to happen is they tend to go to sort of Christian-friendly venues. And they've worked on, for example, TV programs like Home Improvement, Touched by an Angel, Seventh Heaven, things like that, which tends to make the other shops even more secular. But again, illustrating that when we look at those particular areas, we have to have discernment. Does that mean you should never watch television? No, but it does mean that a wise and discerning person would evaluate what is on television. What's on television? Well, naturalism would be one. Look at a few people there. Who's in the upper left-hand corner? That's Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. We've already talked about him. Peter Singer in the upper right-hand corner, a professor at Princeton University who has said that it would be permissible to allow babies to actually die if they had genetic defects. Lower left-hand corner, no longer with us, Christopher Hitchens, who wrote God is Not Good. In the lower right-hand corner, Bill Maher. And so again, you can see that oftentimes when you turn on television, you will see, for example, a worldview of naturalism. Another worldview would be the worldview of pantheism. Who's that guy in the upper left-hand corner there? Yoda, right? George Lucas wanted to take Zen Buddhism and put it into an entertaining format. Deepak Chopra, Shirley MacLaine, and the Dalai Lama. So again, you have the worldview of pantheism. Another worldview that we might think about is the worldview of the occult or Gnosticism. I mentioned the Da Vinci Code or the Matrix, which is kind of a mixture of Christian as well as Gnostic ideas, Harry Potter and all sorts of ideas that are certainly part of the media. And then we have some that involve sensuality. And believe me, I had to look for a while to find ones that probably wouldn't be offensive to you, but whether you talk about Lady Gaga or Madonna or some of the others, Britney Spears, Paris Hilton, I mean, again, you can see some of those ideas are finding their way into our society. For the last few minutes that I have, let me, if I can, for those of you that are parents or grandparents, maybe suggest a few possible rules that you might want to implement. And the first is, when we talk about television, it seems to me that if you really are concerned about some of the things I've just talked about, you might want to reevaluate the location of your television. Make it hard for young people, or even older people, to come and just plop in front of the TV set. When our kids were growing up, we had a TV set but you had doors that were over it, so you had to open the doors, and there was no chairs there, so you'd have to sit on the floor, or you had to bring in a chair. And so it just made it much more difficult to actually turn on the television set. And so that, I think, was very helpful. I would suggest that a child should not have a television in the room. Used to be that TV was pretty safe. When I was growing up, it was Sid Caesar's Show of Shows and Bonanza and Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. There was kind of a covenant between the TV producers and the family that I'm going to produce programs that anybody can watch. Is that the case anymore? On some of these TV programs, you walk in, I've walked in sometimes and it just about turns me into a pillar of salt when I see what's on the program. And to have that in a child's room, I don't think is a good idea. Limit access to that. Choose a few programs ahead of time, watch only those, turn the TV off. Teach your kids that there is a thing known as what? The off button. Just some things that might be helpful. A couple more. What about computers? Again, I would, if you have a family computer, put it in the room. The problem is, it used to be that the only way young people could get on the internet was on the family computer. Now with these smartphones, it's a lot more dangerous, but it still says, I put the family computer in the room where people can see it. It reduces the danger. I wouldn't put a computer in a child's room because, the information superhighway has a lot of great information, but it has some really dark back alleys, doesn't it? And I think a wise parent would watch that as well. Put blocking software on your computers. Teach your child. Sooner or later, they're just going to run into, by accident, into bad sites. Teach them what to do and to stay away. Finally, we might also want to talk about Facebook. I haven't talked about that much tonight and this afternoon, but again, we have lots of great material on the website if you'd like to read a little bit more. But it seems to me that if you have a child that has Facebook, you should have access to the password. So that gives you a chance to check it and make sure what they're saying. Young people don't realize sometimes what they're posting there, everybody gets to see. And I'm sad to say here, but you have to really teach them that the goal here is not to have the most number of friends, but to have friends on Facebook that are real live friends, not people pretending to be a potential friend that is a 30-year-old user of children. And I have lots and lots of stories. You can find our website for more about that just remind us again, real friends that they know. It's not a contest for the most number of friends you have. And again, to keep personal information private. I think some people don't realize that sometimes the information can be made private, that the default is public. And again, you're just letting people know that might want to cause your child harm, how to get to them. Some real dangers that we need to talk about, obviously. But as I wind down, oftentimes when I talk about this, there's some common objections. First objection sometimes is well, that's just reality. Well, okay, but 200,000 acts of violence, 12,000 televised homicides, that's not reality. If anything, we are living in the midst of a media storm that is changing our worldview. Number two, we can say, well, some people say, well, it's just killing time. I live in the real world. There are times when I just want to go to a movie theater and just watch a film. It doesn't have any real great redeeming value, which is kind of fun to watch. Okay, I understand that. There are times when, I just want to kind of surf the internet and see what I can find, or times when I listen to music and I'm not, sitting there concentrating on every word. I understand that. I live in the real world, but you know what? There is a problem. And that is, today we live in this incredible media storm, and we're going to have to learn to make good choices. We're going to have, what's that word again? Discernment. Another one, hey, it won't affect me. Well, I think I've proven to any person that's been listening to this afternoon that it really does affect you. I have television producers every once in a while saying, I don't think our programs affect behavior. And my quick answer to that is, oh, really? You just, in the last Super Bowl, charged $1.5 million for a 30-second commercial so that if I see a swoosh, I want to go out and buy Nike. You cannot tell me that the 8 minutes of commercials in a television program affect consumer behavior, but the 22 minutes of the program don't affect behavior. Of course it does. It does affect you. Hey, no one will know. I can surf on all sorts of websites and do all sorts of things. You know what? First of all, they leave cookies on your website and on your computer, and people trace you down. And, every once in a while I have a mother that will say, I think my son is looking at things they shouldn't be looking at. And since I programmed computers when I went through graduate school, I can get on there and I'm real good at following electronic footprints, and every time I've looked, I've found. But you know what? You could fool some of the people some of the time. You could even fool all of the people all of the time. But you know what? You won't fool God. And again, it's important. Hey, it's just entertainment. You know what? I agree. And if you're hearing me as an individual that says we need to go out and trash our television sets and we're not supposed to be involved in the media, that's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that we need to have discernment and to think biblically about every area of life and recognize that one of the greatest challenges, I think, in the 21st century is the impact that media is having in our lives. Well, again, let me mention our website, probe.org. You can type in the word media, television, film, art, music. You'll find all sorts of different articles. We have the new articles that have just come out about digital media and much more that you can find. Some of our new surveys on how that's even affecting the millennial generation. We're producing programs for churches to really help affect and impact the millennial generation, which in many ways has really fallen off in terms of their biblical belief and biblical practice. So there's a lot of that you can find at the website. If you go to our website, you can also, if you'd like, order a copy of my book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language. It's used more as a textbook, but the real goal there is to, again, help us to think biblically about every area of life. That's why I'm so grateful for this conference, the Apologetics Worldview Conference. Aren't you glad you're here? I'm glad you came.